Okay, so Sean requested that I read one of my own stories, so I'm going to read a snippet from Shadow of Fate 2 with hideously old art, because this writing will probably not make it into the final. Well, maybe, but probably not. So this is how I write Shadow of Fate, and I'm just going to hop on into it. There's going to be no context. So Longer was met by a darkly clad figure blocking his path. To be more precise, he was met by two. Standing by the door, blocking his way, were two figures. One was tall and lanky, with short, wispy white hair with black streaks that looked as if its owner were in serious lack of a comb. He had ash-gray fur and was turned toward the ballroom floor, allowing Longlar to see the purple eyes that glimmered with mirth. He wore blood-red clothing with a black mask, accented by violet that brought out his oddly colored eyes all the more, and his teeth were bared in a sharp, delightful smile. Longlar did not make out the features of his companion, for the shadow cat standing opposite the blood-red-clad one was turned toward the door Longlar was attempting to escape to. All Longlar could make out was a rich, beautiful cape spun from dark green fabric, embroidered with gold, and a sliver of his pale white mask. And before Naomi could call him back or he could second-guess himself, Longlar plunged forward and cut through the area between the two figures. The moment he passed the shadow cat dressed in red, something suddenly caught both of his feet right when he decided to quicken his pace. His heartbeat quickened instead, his pulse lodging itself in his throat. Surprised, and with one hand on his sword hilt, Longlar tumbled to the ground, catching to himself with his right hand just as his knees skimmed the marble. Gasps and whispers followed his fall, and Longlar heard the music falter into a sudden pause, as if he had tripped over its strings. He could feel the whole ballroom staring at him, eyes boring into him as his skimmed knees and scuffed palm seared with pain. Longlar found himself kneeling on the ground, staring at a pair of shadow cat feet with ivory white claws. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry," the shadow cat addressed him in false sincerity. Longlar could hear the merry mockery in his voice. "I didn't see you there. Do you need help up, Savior?" Longlar felt a flash of anger and opened his mouth to snap a retort, but a new voice beat him to it. "Savior," a calm, pleasant tone interrupted, startling him. That was uncalled for. The second voice wrapped its tone around Longlar's mind like a snake coiling around a rodent. He felt the tension in his shoulders loosen at the voice, even as his mind kick-started into overdrive. Longlar heard the shadow cat Severe shift his weight like a scolded dog, and he found his blood freeze in his veins, caught between two desires: to leap to his feet and bolt toward the door, and to remain where he stood until the owner of the velvet voice ordered otherwise. But again, the cool voice saved him from putting too much effort into his decision. "Stand, young Savior," the shadow cat instructed. "There is no need to kneel." Longlar hesitated, every muscle in his body crying out to obey. "Come now, my lord does not bite that often," Severe commented, sounding amused. Longlar slowly stood up, expecting to be run through at any given moment, though he kept his eyes downcast until he stood to his full height. Then he raised his gaze, painfully aware of how quiet the room had become, and found himself staring into blue eyes that regarded him calmly, with a passive interest, as if their owner were observing clouds rolling by overhead versus a humiliated Savior rise to his feet. They were hidden behind a plain white mask with black-rimmed eyes and silver outlining its edges, and the jaw beneath the mask was strong and smooth. He stood a few inches taller than Longlar, but the longer the Savior stared, the greater the height difference seemed. The moment Longlar's eyes locked with the eyes of the shadow cat, a trigger clicked in his mind, A tightness settled over his body that could not be removed. He knew, even without being told, whom he stood nose to nose with. He knew, even though there was no crown above the eyes resting on that brow, even though he appeared just as the rest of his kin did, masked and concealed, that this shadow cat was no commoner. Alan, he breathed shakily before he could stop himself. The shadow cat said nothing and did not move aside. What Longler could see of his features remained unchanged. Longler searched the Shadow King's face, his pulse roaring like a panicking beast in his ears. But there was nothing. Longler felt like he'd opened a book expecting information and was met with blank pages instead. Longler Swift, the Shadow King answered at long last, his eyes running over Longler's markings that peeked out from the bottom of his own mask. I did not expect you to be here, of all places. There was little surprise in his voice, yet the words seemed to ring with enough truth that Longler felt a subtle unease swell within him. He was too speechless to reply, and far too frozen to make any move to take a step back. Alan stood but 2 feet from him, the very man he was destined to stop, the very man who had brought him to where he was, who had leveled Aiden and slipped off into the night. Longler knew nothing about him except that he was a threat to the Guardian, and a threat the Guardian wished Longler to face, a horrible monster of a man who sat in his kingdom and decreed who should die and who should live. Longler knew nothing about the king other than the actions the Shadow Cat had taken against him, the measures he had strived for in order to pluck the Savior from Andon. He had paid Rarain for the duration of Longler's entire life to keep an eye on him and his sister. Longler's mind felt as though someone had blended it into mush, and he heaved in an unsteady breath, his mouth dry. You must be going to the gardens, Alan intoned pleasantly. Longler hated that he knew, and he clamped his mouth shut and nodded mutely. It's a pleasant night to be outside, the king commented. He stepped aside with a flawless grace Longler had seen only in skilled hunters. Despite his weapon at his side and his assurance of being able to defend himself, something small and urgent told Longler that he could not against the man who stood opposite him. Longler stared at Alan, adrenaline rushed through his body. He should run. If he did, would the king chase him? Longler found his eyebrows lowering over his eyes and his hands began to shake, not in fear, but in anger. He was toying with him, testing him, and the entire room waited with bated breath for the Savior to move. Longler took a deep breath. Even now he could hear the whispers of the dancers echoing throughout the eerily silent room that had been full of life moments before. They were still waiting for him to make his move. Longler did. He straightened his shoulders and strode past Alan, brushing shoulders with him briefly before beeline for the garden, his skin prickling. Oh, and Longler, Alan called to him, and Longler's feet halted as if it were the king that commanded him. He looked over his shoulder, tensing, and a small smile graced the dark lips of the Shadow King. Happy birthday, the king congratulated him. Longler stared at him for a long moment, his eyes widening. He caught Naomi in the distance, standing a few paces away from the unfolding scene. Her eyes were wide as she stared after him, and the sight of her caused Longler to jerk his head away with a brisk nod of acknowledgement. Despite his anger, it felt unnatural to not respond to the Shadow King, a feeling that made him shudder with its sway. It took every last nerve to go against the instinct that screamed at him not to turn his back to his sworn source of grief and pain, yet he did, and he strolled into the garden, feeling the dancers' gazes following his every step. The distance from the dance floor to the outside seemed immeasurably longer than it had a moment before, but finally Longler was through the wide open doors. So, that's a scene that I love from Shadow of Fate. Alright, I did it, Shunk. Woohoo!